Sunday mornings in the suburb of Decatur, 20 miles east of Atlanta, had begun the same way for 2 decades. The bells of New Hope Baptist Church summoned worshipers to service at 10 o'clock sharp. The parking lot filled with family sedans and SUVs, from which neatly dressed families emerged with Bibles in hand. Reverend Rayner Clark stood at the church entrance, impeccably dressed as always in a dark suit and burgundy tie. Tall, with graying temples and a welcoming smile, he greeted each parishioner personally. In 20 years of service, Pastor Clark had become more than just the spiritual leader of the community. He was its moral compass, the person people turned to in difficult times. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins. How is your mother feeling?" he would ask an elderly parishioner, genuinely interested in the answer. "Brother Michael, it's good to see you and your family. The children have grown so much," he would say to a young father with 3 sons. Standing next to him was his wife, Margaret, the embodiment of the ideal pastor's wife. Neatly coiffed, she wore a modest knee-length dress and pearl earrings, a gift from her husband on their 10th wedding anniversary. She knew every name, every family history, every joy and sorrow of her parishioners. As a primary school teacher in the same district, Margaret was no less respected than her husband. Their only son, Joshua, a 19-year-old student at a local community college, reluctantly attended services. In recent months, he had increasingly found excuses not to come, citing his studies or his job at the local supermarket. When he did show up, he sat in the back rows, ostentatiously checking his phone and avoiding his parents' gaze. The Clark family is what every Christian family should aspire to be. Dolores Whitman, chair of the church women's committee, told her friends. 23 years of marriage, and they still look at each other like teenagers in love. But if you looked closely, cracks in this perfect facade were becoming apparent. Over the past few months, Pastor Rayner had become distracted. During elders' meetings, he would zone out in the middle of discussions about the budget or Thanksgiving plans. Church Secretary Betty Morgan noticed that he was staying late at the office more often, explaining that he was preparing sermons or counseling parishioners. "He's working too hard," Margaret worried, sharing her concerns with her friend Cindy Foster during their weekly tea party. "Sometimes he doesn't come home until dinner time, or even later. He says he has important meetings with potential donors, or that he's helping families in crisis." Cindy, who was married to a church deacon, nodded in understanding. "Ministry is a heavy cross to bear. Remember how hard it was in the early years? You told me that Rayner hardly slept because he was so worried about every parishioner." "Yes, but it was different then." Margaret stirred sugar into her tea, looking thoughtfully out the window. "Back then, he shared everything with me. He told me about every conversation he had and asked for advice. Now he's become kind of withdrawn." Meanwhile, in the church office, Pastor Rayner sat at his oak desk, purchased when the church was founded. On the wall hung his diploma from Southern Baptist Seminary, photos from various religious conferences, and family pictures. But his gaze was fixed on his cell phone, whose screen displayed a message. "See you today? I miss you." A dot. Rayner quickly deleted the message, as he had been doing for several months. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation and guilt at the same time. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't stop. What had started as a chance encounter at a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta 6 months ago had grown into something more than he could admit to himself. That day in March, he was driving home from a conference of conservative pastors held at the Marriott Hotel in the city center. Traffic was backed up due to an accident on Interstate 20, and Rayner decided to grab a coffee while he waited for the jam to clear. The small Percolator coffee shop on Peachtree Street seemed like a quiet place, far removed from his usual world. Behind the counter stood a young woman with long dark hair and kind eyes. When she handed him his cappuccino, their fingers accidentally touched. "I'm sorry," she said, and there was a special softness in her voice. Her name tag read Alex. "It's okay," Rayner replied, noticing how she looked down, embarrassed. There was a touching vulnerability in that gesture that tugged at his heart. He returned to that coffee shop a week later, and then again the week after that. Each time, he found new reasons to visit downtown Atlanta. Alex turned out to be intelligent, well-read, and able to hold a conversation on any topic, from literature to philosophy. She knew he was a pastor, but that didn't bother her. On the contrary, she asked profound questions about faith, about God, about the meaning of life. "You're not like other clergy," she said once, when the coffee shop was almost empty and they were chatting at a corner table. "You don't have that judgmental, that harshness." Rayner felt something tighten in his chest. "What do you know about other clergymen?" "Enough," she said, turning away toward the window. "I grew up in a strict Catholic family. I wasn't very well accepted there when I became myself." At the time, Rayner didn't fully understand what she meant. The realization came later, during one of their long conversations. Alex was born Alexander, but had been living as a woman for several years. For Rayner, raised with traditional Christian values, this should have been the end of their relationship. But that didn't happen. Instead of disgust, he felt compassion for this strong but lonely woman. Instead of condemnation, he felt a desire to understand and protect her. And gradually, conversation after conversation, that compassion grew into something more. The ringing of the phone snapped him out of his memories. The display lit up with home. "Rayner, where are you? Dinner has been ready for an hour." Margaret's voice sounded strained. "Sorry, honey. I got caught up with reports for Deacon Foster. I'm on my way home." "Okay." Josh asked if he could stay at a friend's house tonight. They have an exam early tomorrow. "Sure. See you in 20 minutes. After hanging up, Rayner looked at the family photo on his desk. Happy faces embracing in front of the church. Margaret smiles, looking at him adoringly. Josh is still small, about 7 years old, in a formal suit for Sunday service. A simple, honest life without secrets or lies. When did it all become so complicated? The Clark family home was located in a quiet neighborhood with neat lawns and white picket fences. The 2-story colonial-style house was Margaret's pride and joy. She had chosen every detail of the interior herself, every plant in the garden. It was their family nest, the place where they planned to grow old together. At dinner, the couple sat across from each other at the oak table that Rayner had made with his own hands in the first year of their marriage. Margaret served his favorite dish, roast chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans, but he had no appetite. "You look tired," Margaret remarked, studying her husband's face. "Maybe you should take a vacation. We haven't gone anywhere in a long time. Remember how nice it was at that lake house 2 years ago?" "Yes, it was nice." Rayner chewed his chicken mechanically, his mind returning to today's message from Alex. "I think we should spend more time together," Margaret continued. "Josh will soon finish college and start his own life, and we'll have a chance to rediscover each other." These words pierced Rayner like a knife. Rediscover each other. If only she knew that he had nothing to discover, only lies and deceit. "You're right," he finally said. "We need to spend more time together." But even as he said these words, he was thinking about tomorrow's meeting with Alex at their usual spot, a small park next to a coffee shop where they could talk without fear of prying eyes. After dinner, while Margaret was washing the dishes, Rayner went up to his study on the pretext of preparing for tomorrow's sermon. The topic was ironic: honesty as the foundation of Christian life. He had already rewritten the text several times, but the words did not come together. How could he preach about honesty while living a double life? At midnight, he was still sitting at his computer, staring at a blank page. Outside the window, the autumn wind was howling, tearing the last leaves from the oak tree he had planted on Josh's birthday. Usually, this tree calmed him, reminding him of the continuity of generations, of constancy amid change. But today, it seemed to be a witness to his hypocrisy. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked as Margaret went to bed. She no longer waited for him, having grown accustomed to his staying up late. 6 months ago, she would have gone up to him, brought him hot tea, and sat with him while he worked. Now there was an invisible wall between them, one he had built himself with lies and half-truths. Reiner opened his phone and reread Alex's message. "See you today, I miss you." A dot. Such simple words, but they meant more than many sermons about love. With Alex, he could be himself. Not the perfect pastor, not the flawless husband, but simply a man with all his doubts and weaknesses. He started typing a reply, then deleted it. He started again. "I can't today, sorry." He pressed send and immediately regretted it. Almost immediately, a reply came. "Are you okay? You sound sad." Even in a short message, Alex could sense his mood better than his wife had in 23 years of marriage. This realization was painful and sweet at the same time. "It's complicated," he wrote. "I know, but you're not alone. Remember that." Reiner turned off his phone and rested his head in his hands. Around him was a house built on lies, a family that didn't know who he really was, a community that saw him as a paragon of righteousness. And somewhere in the center of Atlanta lived a woman who accepted him for who he was, demanding neither perfection nor holiness. The Percolator coffee shop on Peachtree Street was almost empty on Thursday morning. Just a few regulars with their laptops and a lone woman by the window, slowly stirring her latte and watching the passers-by. Alex Rivera started her shift at 7 in the morning, as usual, but her thoughts were far from work. Reiner's message from yesterday, "It's complicated," kept her awake. Over the 6 months of their strange, secret relationship, she had learned to read between the lines of his short messages. He was desperate, torn between two worlds, and she understood that better than anyone. Alex knew what it meant to live a double life. 28 years ago, she was born Alexander Rivera into a strict Catholic family in a small town in northern Georgia. Her father worked as a foreman at a sawmill. Her mother was a housewife and an active member of the local church. She had 2 younger sisters who lived up to their parents' expectations. They married local boys, had children, and lived quiet provincial lives. Alexander, however, had felt uncomfortable in his own body since childhood. At the age of 6, he asked his mother to buy him a dress like his sisters had. At 10, he secretly painted his lips with his mother's lipstick and combed his hair, imagining how it would look if it were long. At 14, when the changes of adolescence began, he thought about suicide for the first time. "This is a devilish temptation," said Father Martinez when 16-year-old Alexander mustered the courage to open up to the priest during confession. "Pray harder, my son. God is testing your faith." Prayer did not help. On the contrary, with each passing year, the dissonance between his inner feelings and his outward appearance became more unbearable. At 18, Alexander left for Atlanta under the pretext of attending technical college. His parents were proud. Their son was the first in the family to receive a higher education. The first years in the big city were difficult. Alexander worked in restaurants and shops, rented a tiny room in the Grant Park area, and slowly saved money for therapy and hormone treatment. At the age of 22, he wore a woman's dress for the first time, not in secret, but publicly, at a transgender support group meeting at the Atlanta LGBT Community Center. "What would you like to be called?" asked the group coordinator, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and short hair. "Alex," she replied, and for the first time in her life, that name sounded right. The transition took several years. Hormone therapy, changing documents, painful conversations with family that ended in a complete breakdown of relations. Her mother cried on the phone, "You killed my son." His father simply hung up and never answered his calls again. At the age of 26, Alex got a job at the Percolator coffee shop. The owner, Deborah Cheng, belonged to a sexual minority herself and created an atmosphere of acceptance and safety in the establishment. People of different orientations and identities worked here, and you could be yourself without fear of judgment. And then one day in March, a tall man in a formal suit approached the counter. He ordered a cappuccino and sat down at a corner table overlooking the street. Alex noticed how nervous he was, tapping his fingers on the table, glancing frequently at his phone. These were the usual signs of stress that many visitors from the business district experienced. When she brought him his coffee, their eyes met. There was none of the usual curiosity or judgment she often saw in strangers trying to determine her biological sex. Only fatigue and a kind of deep sadness. "Thank you," he said, and there was an unexpected warmth in his voice. "You're welcome. Rough day?" Alex asked, even though she didn't usually engage in conversation with customers. He looked at her in surprise, as if he hadn't expected sympathy from a stranger. "You could say that. Have you worked here long?" 2 years. I like it here. It's peaceful." "Yes, I can tell." He looked around the cozy coffee shop with its soft lighting, bookshelves, and paintings by local artists. "I'm Rainer, by the way." "Alex." She pointed to her name tag. "If you need anything else, let me know." He came back a week later, and then another week after that. Gradually, their brief exchanges of pleasantries turned into real conversations. Alex learned that he was a pastor at a Baptist church in the suburbs, married with a grown son. He learned that she was studying literature at night school, loved poetry, and dreamed of writing a novel someday. "You're not like other clergy," she said one day in late May, when the coffee shop was almost empty before closing time. "What kind have you known?" Rainer asked, a note of tension in his voice. Alex told him about her childhood, her strict Catholic family, and how the church had become a source of pain rather than comfort. She didn't talk directly about her transgender identity. She wasn't ready to lose this strange friend who accepted her simply as Alex. "I'm sorry," Rainer said when she finished. "The church should be a place of love and acceptance, not condemnation." "Do you really believe that?" "I try to." He fell silent, staring into his cup. "Sometimes it's harder than I'd like." In June, their relationship changed. Rainer came to the coffee shop upset after a conflict with the church deacon about including new songs in the service. Alex was closing her shift and suggested they take a walk in the small park around the corner. They sat on a bench under a large oak tree, and Rainer talked about his doubts about his ministry, about how hard it was to be a role model when he was full of contradictions himself. "All people are full of contradictions," Alex said. "That's normal. Not for a pastor. People expect me to have all the answers, to be flawless, to have unshakable faith. What if faith can be stronger because of doubts? What if an honest search is more important than dogmatic answers?" Rainer looked at her in surprise. "Have you studied theology?" "I read a lot. I'm trying to understand if there's a place for people like me in God's world." "Of course there is." He said it without hesitation, with such conviction that Alex felt a lump in her throat. Where does that confidence come from? Because God is love, and love does not exclude, it accepts. At that moment, Alex realized she was falling in love. Not with his appearance or status, but with his ability to see the person behind the facade, with his struggle for a gentler, more accepting faith. In July, she gathered the courage to tell him the whole truth about herself. They were walking in the same park after her shift, and Alex felt her heart pounding in her chest. "Rainer, there's something you need to know about me," she began, stopping by the fountain. He turned to her, waiting for her to continue. "I was born in a man's body. I am a transgender woman." The silence lasted an eternity. Alex braced herself for rejection, for anger, for Bible quotes about sin and perversion. But Rainer just looked at her, and in his eyes there was pain, not condemnation, but compassion. "How hard it must have been for you," he finally said. "Aren't you leaving?" "Why should I leave?" "Because you're a pastor, because your church teaches—my church teaches many things. but the most important thing it should teach is to love one another. He took her hand. You are the most honest person I know, Alex. You fight for the right to be yourself in a world that doesn't accept it. There is more faith in that than in any sermon. That evening, they kissed. Carefully, gently, like two people who know the value of every moment of intimacy. Meanwhile, in the suburbs of Decatur, Margaret Clark sat at the kitchen table, sorting through bills and planning the week's menu. But her thoughts were preoccupied with her husband. In recent months, Rainer had become a different person, distracted, secretive, distant. At first, she chalked it up to stress. There was indeed a lot going on at the church: roof repairs, preparations for Christmas events, conflict between older and younger parishioners over the musical accompaniment for services. But now Margaret was beginning to notice details that didn't fit with the picture of an overworked pastor. Yesterday she found a receipt from a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta in his jacket pocket. Percolator. The name was unfamiliar to her. When she asked Rainer about it at breakfast, he replied that he had stopped there after meeting with potential sponsors for the church's homeless program. That's a strange name for a coffee shop, Margaret remarked. Yes, but the coffee's not bad, Rainer said, without looking up from his newspaper. Were the sponsors interested? They're still considering the proposal. Margaret nodded, but something in her husband's tone alarmed her. In 23 years of marriage, she had learned to distinguish his intonations. Now he was speaking in that cautious tone he used when he wanted to avoid detailed questions. The next day, she decided to drive by the Percolator. The coffee shop was in the Midtown area, surrounded by galleries and boutiques. Not exactly the kind of place where church sponsors usually meet. Margaret didn't go inside, but she made a mental note of the address. At home, she searched for information about the coffee shop on the internet. The website featured a photo of the cozy interior, a menu with exotic drink names, and an About Us section. Owner Deborah Cheng wrote about creating an inclusive space for all people, regardless of their identity and orientation. The events section mentioned poetry evenings, exhibitions by LGBT artists, and support group meetings. Margaret closed her laptop with a heavy heart. Of course, Rainer could have just happened to walk into this coffee shop, but then, why didn't he tell her about its special features? He usually shared his impressions of new places, especially if they were unusual. On Saturday, she decided to conduct an experiment. When Rainer left for the morning presbytery meeting at church, Margaret checked the odometer in his car. During dinner, she casually asked how his day had gone. The usual, meeting with the elders, then worked in my office, Rainer replied. Didn't you go anywhere? No, I spent the whole day at church. But the odometer showed an extra 40 miles. That's exactly how far it is to downtown Atlanta and back. On Sunday after the service, Margaret stayed behind at the church to help remove the flowers from the altar. Betty Morgan, the church secretary, approached her with a concerned look. Margaret, I'm sorry to interfere, but I've noticed that Pastor Rainer has been acting strange lately. In what way? Margaret tried to keep her voice calm. He's often away from his office without saying where he's going. Sometimes he doesn't come back until evening. And yesterday I happened to see him deleting messages on his phone. He saw me looking and got very embarrassed. Maybe it's personal matters concerning parishioners. You know how much he cares about everyone. Maybe. Betty didn't look convinced. Just know that if you need to talk, I'm always here for you. That night, Margaret lay awake next to her husband, who was fast asleep with his back turned to her. They used to sleep in each other's arms, even after many years of marriage. Now it was as if an invisible wall had grown between them. She tried to remember when everything had changed. About 6 months ago, Rainer had become more pensive and started traveling to Atlanta more often on mysterious business. At the same time, he bought a new phone, explaining that his old one had started to slow down. He became more careful with his new device, always placing it face down and quickly putting it away if she approached. Margaret grew up in a family where husbands did not cheat on their wives. Her parents were married for 46 years until her father's death, and she never doubted their fidelity to each other. Infidelity seemed to her to be something distant, something that happened to other people, not to a pastor's family. But all the signs pointed to it. Secret trips, lies about his whereabouts, secrecy with his phone, emotional detachment. Margaret felt the world she had built over 23 years crumbling around her. The worst part was not knowing for sure. Suspicions gnawed at her, forcing her to analyze her husband's every word, every gesture. She began to wake up at night, listening to his breathing, wondering, what is he thinking about? Who is he thinking about? On Monday morning, Rainer went to church as usual. Margaret took sick leave, for the first time in 3 years, and drove to downtown Atlanta. She parked across from the Percolator coffee shop and waited, not knowing what for. At 1:30, she saw a familiar figure. Rainer was walking down Peachtree Street, but he wasn't alone. Next to him was a young woman with long, dark hair. They were talking animatedly about something, and Rainer looked more relaxed than he had at home in recent months. Margaret gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The woman was beautiful. Not classically beautiful, but there was something attractive about her, a kind of naturalness and grace. She looked 10 to 15 years younger than Margaret. The couple stopped at the entrance to a coffee shop. Rainer said something, and the woman laughed, touching his hand. The gesture was so intimate, so familiar, that Margaret's breath caught in her throat. They entered the coffee shop together. Margaret sat in the car for another hour but couldn't bring herself to follow them. When they finally came out, they headed toward a small park. Rainer was carrying 2 paper cups. Margaret started the car and drove home. The trip took 40 minutes, but she didn't remember a single mile. One thought kept running through her head. 23 years of marriage, a child together, a life together. Could all that really be thrown away for a young woman from a coffee shop? At home, she sat down at the kitchen table and cried for the first time in many years, bitterly, desperately, the way people cry when everything they believed in falls apart. Tuesday began as a normal day in the Clark household. Rainer left for the morning church service, and Margaret got ready for school. But the night before, she had made a decision that changed everything. After seeing her husband with that woman at the coffee shop, Margaret couldn't settle down. She rushed around the house trying to find an explanation for what she had seen that wouldn't destroy her world. Maybe it was a parishioner who needed spiritual support. Maybe a relative of someone from the church. But the intimacy of their interaction, the way the woman touched Rainer's hand, his relaxed manner around her, none of it seemed like pastoral care. Margaret decided to find out the truth, no matter what it took. In the morning, she took another sick day and drove to the Percolator coffee shop. This time, she didn't stay in her car, but went inside. Behind the counter stood the same woman, young, attractive, with kind eyes and confident movements. "Welcome to Percolator. What would you like to order?" she asked with a smile. "A cappuccino, please." Margaret studied her face, trying to understand what was so special about her. "Sure. My name is Alex, if you need anything else." Alex. Margaret remembered that name. She sat down at a table in the corner and watched Alex serve other customers. There was a special gentleness in her manner, almost a femininity that seemed innate. She chatted easily with the regulars, laughed at their jokes, and remembered their usual orders. "First time here?" Alex approached Margaret's table when the flow of customers had subsided. "Yes, it's a very cozy place." "I like it too. There's a special atmosphere here. People feel free, they can be themselves." Something in her tone caught Margaret's attention. "What do you mean?" Alex paused for a moment, as if weighing how much she could tell a stranger. "Well, you know, in most places people play roles. Here you can just be yourself, without masks or pretensions." After these words, Margaret felt the falseness of her own life even more acutely. For 23 years, she had played the role of the perfect pastor's wife, while her husband took off his masks in this coffee shop with this woman. She sat in the cafe for over an hour, hoping to see Rayner, but he didn't show up. Instead, Margaret learned something else. At the next table sat two middle-aged women, one of whom was telling her friend, "You know, that barista Alex, she used to be a man. Deborah told me. Surprising, isn't it? I would never have guessed. She's so feminine." "Really? How did you find out?" Deborah is very proud of creating an inclusive environment. She says Alex had a difficult history with her family. Her parents turned their backs on her when she decided to transition. Margaret's world spun. Her friend's words echoed in her head. Alex used to be a man. Transgender. Her husband, the pastor of a conservative Baptist church, was cheating on her with a transgender woman. She ran out of the coffee shop and barely made it to her car before she threw up. 23 years of marriage, her family's reputation, their standing in the community, all came crashing down in one fell swoop. At home, Margaret locked herself in her bedroom and opened her Bible to the familiar verses from Leviticus. "Thou shalt not lie with mankind, as with womankind. It is abomination." Then Deuteronomy. "A woman shall not wear men's clothing, nor shall a man put on women's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." All her life, these verses had been absolute truth to her, the irrefutable word of God. She taught them to her children in Sunday school and quoted them during discussions about modern morality. And now it turned out that her own husband was violating the most basic biblical principles. The worst part was the realization that Rayner knew. He couldn't have been unaware of Alex's past. They were clearly close. There was trust between them. That meant he had consciously chosen sin, consciously betrayed not only his family, but also his faith. By evening, when Rayner returned home, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea. She wasn't crying. The tears had stopped 3 hours ago. Now she felt only cold rage. "Hi, honey. How was your day?" Rayner kissed her on the cheek as usual. "Informative," Margaret replied without looking up. "Is something wrong? You look upset." "Rayner, sit down. We need to talk." Something in her tone made him wary. He slowly sat down opposite her, studying her face. "I know about Alex," Margaret said quietly. Rayner paled. For a second, his face was completely open, frightened, guilty, desperate. Then he pulled himself together. "What are you talking about?" "Your mistress from the Percolator coffee shop, the woman you've been seeing for 6 months while I thought you were working for the church." Rayner covered his face with his hands. "Margaret. And the most interesting thing is, do you know that she used to be a man?" The silence was deafening. Rayner raised his head, and in his eyes was the hopelessness of a man driven into a corner. "How did you find out?" "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that it's true, my truth now. Rayner, you're cheating on me with a transgender person." "Don't call her that," he flared up unexpectedly. "She has a name." Alex's defense hurt Margaret more than any confession. So he really does feel something for this woman. It's not just physical attraction or a midlife crisis. "You're defending her? You're defending this abomination in front of your own wife?" "Alex isn't an abomination. She's a kind, honest person who destroyed our family. She didn't destroy anything. It was me. It was all me." Rayner stood up and began pacing around the kitchen. "You don't understand, Margaret. With her, I can be myself. Not a perfect pastor, not a flawless husband, not a role model. Just a human being." "And you can't be yourself with me?" Margaret's voice trembled with rage. 23 years of marriage isn't enough to be yourself? This isn't about you. This is exactly about me, about us, about the fact that you betrayed everything we believed in. And what did we believe in, Margaret? That we should condemn people for who they were born? That love is only possible in one single, correct form? We believed in the Bible, in the Word of God, in the sanctity of marriage. The sanctity of marriage? Rayner stopped and looked at her. What sanctity is there in a marriage without love? In a life where every day you have to pretend to be someone else? Don't you love me? Margaret felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. It's complicated. No, it's not complicated. Yes or no? Do you love me? Rainer was silent for a long time. Too long. I respect you. I appreciate you. You're a wonderful mother, a remarkable teacher. That's not love. No, he whispered. Not love, not like hers. He nodded, unable to say it out loud. Margaret felt something inside her break completely. Not just her heart, something deeper, the foundation of her identity. She had been a good wife, a good mother, a good Christian. She had done everything right, followed all the commandments, sacrificed her desires for the sake of her family and the church. And what was the result? Her husband chose a person who violates the most basic laws of nature and God over her. Where is God's justice? She asked, staring at the ceiling. Where is the reward for a righteous life? Margaret. For 23 years, I was the perfect pastor's wife. I smiled when I wanted to cry. I kept quiet when I wanted to scream. I supported your ministry, raised your son, and ran your household. And for what? So you could leave me for a pervert? Don't talk about Alex like that. How else should I talk about him? It's unnatural, Rainer. It's a sin. You're a pastor, you should understand that. I understand that love cannot be a sin. This is not love. It is a disease, a temptation of the devil. Then the devil is kinder than your God, Rainer said quietly but clearly. These words struck Margaret like a bolt of lightning. Her husband, an ordained minister of God, had just uttered blasphemy in their own home. How dare you? Alex accepts me as I am, with all my doubts and contradictions. Your God demands perfection that no human being can give. My God? He is our God, the God you've served for 20 years. Maybe I didn't serve the right God. Margaret stood up so abruptly that the cup fell to the floor and shattered. The shards scattered across the kitchen like fragments of her life. You're crazy. That man has robbed you of your sanity. Alex helped me find it. Choose, Margaret said, her voice sounding metallic. Me or her, family or sin, God or the devil. Rainer looked at her for a long time, and there was sadness in his eyes. If it's a choice between love and hate, I choose love. So you choose her. I choose honesty. Then get out of my house. Margaret, get out. Now, and don't come back until you've come to your senses. Rainer silently got up, took his car keys, and headed for the door. At the threshold, he turned around. I'll pick up my things tomorrow when you're not home. Don't you dare! I'll be here and I'll make sure you don't steal anything that belongs to our family. Fine. Then I'll come back with the police if I have to. After the door closed behind Rainer, Margaret sank to the floor amid the shards of the broken cup. She sat there until morning, not crying, not praying, just sitting in the ruins of her life. By dawn, she knew what she had to do. If God would not protect her family, her faith, her way of life, then she would do it herself. Some sins cannot be forgiven. Some insults demand retribution. And Rainer would come to church tomorrow to prepare his Sunday sermon, as he had done for 20 years. Only now he would not be a righteous pastor, but a deceitful sinner. And she would be waiting for him there. Wednesday, 6:30 a.m. New Hope Baptist Church stood in the pre-dawn silence, shrouded in fog that rose slowly from the damp ground. The parking lot was empty except for one car, a dark Ford sedan belonging to Reverend Rainer Clark. Rainer spent the night at the Country Inn Motel on Interstate 20, but he couldn't sleep. His wife's words echoed in his head, choose me or her. He made his choice, but the price was higher than he had imagined. 23 years of marriage, a respectable life, his position in the community, all collapsed in one evening. At 6:30 in the morning, he arrived at the church. He had to prepare his Sunday sermon, go through his mail, and gather his thoughts before telling the elders about his decision to leave his position as pastor. He could no longer preach about the sanctity of marriage from the pulpit, knowing that his heart belonged to another person. Rayner opened the door to the church office with his key. The familiar smell of old wood and books, the soft light of the desk lamp, the family photos on the shelves, all of it now seemed to belong to another life. He sat down at the oak desk, turned on the computer, and began typing his letter of resignation. At 7:45 a.m., Secretary Betty Morgan parked her Honda near the main entrance. She always arrived first to sort the mail and prepare the office for the workday. She wasn't surprised to see the pastor's car. In recent months, Rayner had often arrived early. Betty entered through the main entrance, turned on the lights in the foyer, and headed for her desk in the reception area next to the pastor's office. The door to his office was closed, but light was shining through the crack. "Good morning, Pastor Rayner," she called out as she began sorting yesterday's mail. There was no response. Betty continued working, thinking that the pastor might be praying or preparing his sermon and didn't want to be disturbed. But after half an hour, the silence began to alarm her. Usually, Rayner would come out to say hello, ask about the mail, and offer her coffee. At 8:30, Deacon Thomas Foster arrived for a morning meeting about the upcoming roof repairs. Betty explained the situation, and they walked together to the pastor's office door. "Pastor Rayner, you have a meeting with Deacon Foster." Betty knocked. Silence. "Maybe he fell asleep at his desk?" Foster suggested. "I remember doing that myself once after a long night working on a church project." Betty tried to turn the handle. The door was locked from the inside. "Pastor Rayner, are you all right?" Foster knocked louder. When that didn't help, they decided to call a locksmith. But Foster, a practical man, first walked around the outside of the church building, checking the windows of the pastor's office. Through the window, covered with light curtains, he saw Rayner's silhouette at the desk. The pastor's head was thrown back in his chair, his arms hanging down at his sides. "Betty, call an ambulance!" Foster shouted, breaking the window with a rock. But when he climbed inside and got closer, it became clear that an ambulance was no longer needed. A dark stain of blood spread across Reverend Rayner Clark's shirt. A kitchen knife lay on the floor next to the chair. The first police cars arrived at 9:15. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, the first to arrive at the scene, immediately noticed several details. The door was locked from the inside, the window had been broken from the outside by the deacon, and there were no signs of a struggle in the office. "Looks like suicide," he said to his partner. He locked the door so no one would disturb him. But half an hour later, when Detective Sarah Thompson arrived, the picture began to look more complicated. Sarah Thompson, a 38-year-old detective with the Fulton County Police Department, had seen many strange deaths in her 14 years of service. Divorced and childless, she had devoted herself entirely to her work. Her colleagues respected her for her professionalism and intuition, although many considered her too cynical and suspicious. "Where's the knife?" she asked as she examined the body. "On the floor, next to the chair," Sergeant Rodriguez replied. "Where's the blood on the floor?" "What do you mean?" "If he stabbed himself and then the knife fell, where are the bloody tracks from the knife to where it lies?" Rodriguez looked closely. The knife lay too neatly, with no drops of blood around it. Maybe it didn't fall right away. "Look at the wound," Thompson pointed to the pastor's chest. "The blow was struck at an angle from left to right, from bottom to top. Try stabbing yourself like that." Rodriguez tried to reproduce the movement. It felt unnatural and uncomfortable. "Besides," the detective continued, "look at his hands. No cuts, no signs that he tried to defend himself. If a person decides to kill himself with a knife, there are usually trial cuts, hesitations." She noticed the open laptop on the table. The screen showed the beginning of a letter. "To the elders of New Hope Church, it is with a heavy heart that I announce my decision to leave my position as pastor." "Interesting. A letter of resignation, but not a suicide note," Thompson remarked. At 10:30, the crime scene investigation team arrived. The detective began interviewing witnesses, starting with those who had discovered the body. "Betty, tell me in detail about this morning." Thompson sat down opposite the church secretary in the conference room. Betty Morgan, a 62-year-old woman who had worked at the church for 15 years, looked shaken. Her hands trembled as she tried to answer the questions. "I arrived at the usual time at 7:45. The pastor's car was already in the parking lot. I called out good morning to him, but he didn't answer. I thought he was praying or preparing for the sermon." "How has Pastor Clark been acting lately? Have there been any changes in his behavior?" Betty hesitated. "Well, he became more distracted. He was often absent without explaining where he was going. Sometimes he would receive messages and immediately delete them." "How often did this happen?" "For the last 3 or 4 months, and recently Mrs. Clark came and asked if I knew where he was spending his time." "Did Mrs. Clark suspect something?" "I don't want to gossip about the pastor's family." "Betty, this is a murder investigation. Gossip has nothing to do with it." "Murder?" "But I thought, we're considering all possibilities. What did Mrs. Clark say?" "She was worried. She said her husband had become secretive, often staying late at work, but when she called the church, he wasn't there." Next, Thompson questioned Deacon Thomas Foster. The 55-year-old owner of a local construction company seemed calmer, but he was also in shock. "Pastor Rayner was a good man," Foster said. "Yes, he seemed troubled lately, but I never thought he was capable of this." "Didn't you think it might not be suicide?" Foster looked surprised. "What else?" "The door was locked from the inside." "Tell me about your relationship with the pastor. Were there any conflicts?" "Minor disagreements about the church budget. He wanted to spend more on social programs. I thought we needed to repair the roof first. But these were normal work issues. Nothing serious." "What do you know about the pastor's personal life?" Foster hesitated again. "There were rumors that he was having problems with his wife, but I didn't think much of it. All married couples have difficulties." At 11:45, Detective Thompson drove to the Clark family home. The suburban house looked perfectly maintained from the outside, but when Margaret opened the door, it was clear that something was wrong inside. Margaret Clark looked as if she hadn't slept all night. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair was disheveled, and her clothes were stained, possibly from cooking or cleaning. But there was more than grief in her eyes. There was a strange determination. "Mrs. Clark? I'm Detective Thompson from the Fulton County Police Department. May I come in?" "Is he dead?" Margaret asked without preamble. "Unfortunately, yes. I'm very sorry for your loss." Margaret let the detective into the house. The living room was unusually quiet, no background noise from the TV or radio that usually accompanied family life. "When was the last time you saw your husband?" Thompson asked, taking out his notebook. "Last night. We had an argument. He left." "What was the argument about?" Margaret was silent for a long time, as if weighing how much of the truth she could tell. "He was cheating on me," she said finally. "I found out and demanded an explanation. He didn't deny it." "Do you know who?" "Some woman from a coffee shop downtown Atlanta. Alex, I think." "How did you react?" "How would any wife react? I was furious. I told him to choose, me or her." "And what did he choose?" "Her." Margaret's voice became metallic. 23 years of marriage and he chose a stranger. "What did you do after he left?" "I cleaned up, I cooked. I tried to figure out what to do next." "Did you leave the house in the evening or at night?" "I was here the whole time." "Can anyone confirm that?" "My son was supposed to come home late, but he ended up staying at a friend's house. So no one can confirm it." The detective wrote this down in her notebook. "Mrs. Clark, do you have keys to the church?" "Of course. I was the pastor's wife." "And where are the keys now?" Margaret pointed to a hook by the front door where a bunch of keys hung. "Here. Why do you ask? Didn't Rayner do it himself? We're looking into all possibilities. Have you told anyone about your husband's affair?" Not yet. I wanted to think it over first. After talking to Margaret, the detective drove to downtown Atlanta to the Percolator coffee shop. Alex was on duty and seemed calm until Thompson broke the news. Rayner is dead? Alex's face paled. How? What happened? We're investigating the circumstances. Did you know Mr. Clark? Yes, he was a good friend. Just a friend? Alex hesitated. We were close. How close? I loved him. Tears began to roll down Alex's cheeks. And he loved me. We were planning he wanted to divorce his wife. When was the last time you saw him? The day before yesterday. We met in the park after my shift. He was upset, said things were getting harder at home. Did he say anything about telling his wife the truth? Yes. He said he couldn't live a double life anymore. That honesty was better than lies, even if it caused pain. Where were you last night? At home. I was reading and making dinner. I live alone, so there's no one to confirm it. Do you have keys to the church? To the church? No, of course not. Why? But the detective was already writing down another person without an alibi in her notebook. By Wednesday evening, Detective Thompson returned to the station empty-handed. The three main suspects were the wife, the mistress, and the deacon with financial disagreements, and all three had motives and no alibis. But what bothered her most was Margaret Clark's behavior. The woman was too calm for a widow who had just lost her husband. And there was a strange gleam in her eyes when she talked about the affair, not grief, but something closer to satisfaction. Sarah, do you think his wife killed him? Sergeant Rodriguez asked, studying the records. I don't know. But tomorrow we'll get the autopsy results and the fingerprints from the knife. Maybe then we'll have a clearer picture. Meanwhile, at the Clark family home, Margaret sat in the kitchen reading the Bible. The page was open to the Book of Numbers. But if anyone kills a person intentionally, he must be put to death. She closed the book and smiled for the first time in 2 days. God's judgment had been carried out. The sinner had been punished. Order had been restored. Thursday, 8 a.m. Detective Sarah Thompson sat in her office at the Fulton County Police Department, studying the results of the medical examiner's report. Coroner David Chen was as precise as ever. Time of death between 11 p.m. Tuesday and 2 a.m. Wednesday. 1 stab wound to the heart. Death was almost instantaneous, she read aloud. The angle of the wound indicates that the blow was delivered by someone approximately the same height as the victim. Rayner was 6 feet 1 inch tall. Margaret was 5 feet 7 inches. Alex was 5 feet 6 inches. Thomas Foster was 6 feet. But the most important thing was the fingerprints on the knife. There were 2 sets, Rayner's and another one that had already been compared to the database. At 9:15, forensic technician James Pack entered. Detective, we have a fingerprint match. The second set belongs to Margaret Clark. Thompson nodded. What about the church? Have you checked the surveillance camera footage? There are no cameras in the church itself, but there is one at the gas station across the street that faces the parking lot. We got the footage. They watched the video on the computer. At 11:47 p.m., a familiar car, Margaret Clark's Honda Accord, pulled into the church parking lot. At 12:43 a.m., the car left. 56 minutes, Thompson noted. Enough time for a conversation and a murder. There's something else, Pack added. We found a bloodstain at the crime scene that doesn't belong to the victim. Type O negative. Margaret Clark has that blood type according to her medical records. Did she cut herself during the struggle? Possibly. Or she accidentally cut herself with the knife after the murder. At 10:30, the detective went to the Clark residence with a search warrant. Margaret greeted her calmly, almost with relief. I knew you would come, she said, letting the police into the house. Margaret Clark, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Rayner Clark. The detective read her rights. Can I change first? Margaret asked, looking at her housecoat. In the bedroom, changing into a simple black dress, Margaret felt calm for the first time in 2 days. No more pretending, no more feigning grief, no more making up alibis. She had done what she had to do. On the kitchen table lay a bandage stained with blood. She had cut her hand while washing the knife after the murder. A stupid mistake, but now it didn't matter. At the police station, Margaret confessed almost immediately. "Yes, I killed him," she told Detective Thompson in the interrogation room. "He desecrated everything that was sacred, our marriage, his ministry, the Word of God." "Tell me what happened that night." Margaret folded her hands on the table and spoke in an even, almost emotionless tone. "I couldn't sleep after our conversation. I kept thinking about how he chose that pervert over his family. At 11:30, I decided to go to the church. I thought maybe I could talk to him again, make him see reason." "Did you take a knife from the house?" "Yes, a kitchen knife. Not for murder, but for protection. I didn't know what state he was in case he became aggressive." "What happened at the church?" "He was sitting at the computer, writing a letter of resignation. Can you imagine? Instead of repenting, he was going to quit the ministry. I tried to change his mind. I said we could forget everything and start over if he broke up with this woman." "And what did he say?" "That he couldn't live a lie, that he loved her more than me, that God would forgive him because love couldn't be a sin." Margaret clenched her fists. "Blasphemy in the house of God. And then you hit him?" "I tried to make him read the Bible. I opened it to Leviticus, the verses about abominations. And he said that these verses were written by people, not God, that the true God is love." Margaret fell silent, remembering that moment. Then everything happened quickly. I felt something break inside me. For 23 years, I had lived according to God's commandments, and he called them human inventions. Somehow, the knife ended up in my hand. Did Rayner try to defend himself? He just looked at me and said, "Forgive me, Margaret." Even at the end, he was only thinking about his sin, not what he had done to me. "What did you do after the murder?" "I washed the knife in the church bathroom, locked his office with his key, and put the keys back in his pocket through the window broken by the deacon. I thought it would look like suicide." "Why did you take the knife home?" "I wanted to put it back in the kitchen, but I cut myself when I washed it. The blood reminded me of what had happened." The detective closed her notebook. "Mrs. Clark, do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" "I understand that I did God's will," Margaret replied with the same frightening calmness. The trial began 3 months later. Margaret's court-appointed attorney, Robert Hamilton, attempted to build a defense based on temporary insanity. "My client suffered severe psychological shock upon learning of her husband's affair with a transgender woman," he stated in court. "It contradicted all her religious beliefs and principles." But Margaret rejected this line of defense. "I was of sound mind," she told the judge. "I knew what I was doing. My husband had desecrated the sanctity of marriage and rejected the Word of God. Someone had to stop him." District Attorney Jesse Wilson presented detailed evidence to the court: fingerprints, camera recordings, and the defendant's confession. Defense witnesses spoke of Margaret as an exemplary wife and mother, an active churchgoer, and a teacher with an impeccable reputation. "I've known this woman for 20 years, said Deacon Foster. "She never showed aggression. She was the embodiment of Christian virtues." But the prosecution witnesses painted a different picture. Alex Rivera testified about her relationship with Rayner, how he struggled with guilt but couldn't give up love. "He was going to get a proper divorce," she said, struggling to hold back tears. "He didn't want to cheat on his wife anymore. He planned to leave the ministry and start a new life." Joshua Clark's son testified that in recent months, his mother had become obsessed with suspicions of his father's infidelity. She followed him, checked his things, even hired a private investigator, the young man said. She constantly quoted the Bible about punishment for sins. Psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Cowan, who examined Margaret, concluded, "The defendant suffers from religious fanaticism, exacerbated by narcissistic personality disorder. She is incapable of accepting reality that contradicts her worldview." The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Patrick O'Connor sentenced Margaret Clark to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "Religious beliefs do not give you the right to take another person's life," he said in his sentencing statement. "You took on the role of God, and now you must bear the responsibility." Margaret listened to the sentence without emotion. As she was led away, she turned to the packed courtroom and said, "The Lord sees the truth. He knows I was defending His word." New Hope Church closed a month after the trial. Half of the congregation moved to other churches, unable to survive the scandal. The building was sold to a real estate development company. Alex Rivera moved to another state, unable to withstand the media attention and condemnation of the conservative community. She found a job at a small college library and continues to write poetry about love and loss. Joshua Clark transferred to a university in California. He never spoke publicly again about the tragedy that destroyed his family. Margaret leads a quiet life in a Georgia women's prison. She reads the Bible every day, participates in the prison choir, and leads a Bible study group for other inmates. She still believes she did the right thing. Margaret continues to believe that she was an instrument of God's will,